Good day to you, a good Thanksgiving day to you. I'd like to share in this daily dose about that first Thanksgiving. That was in the fall of 1621. But a little history to begin. The Catholic Church dominated Europe until the Protestant Reformation came along, and that Reformation reached into England. And indeed, England cut ties with the Roman Catholic Church, but in its place it established the Church of England. So it now went from Pope to King or Queen in overseeing an official state-run church. In the midst of that, those who had been converted to the faith of the Reformers sought to bring about reform, recognizing that the Church of England was in need of it. They were called the Puritans. And some of those Puritans separated and ended up going to Holland. They were called the Pilgrims. And they're in Holland fleeing persecution from King James, from the Church of England. Some of them had been fined, imprisoned, even put to death. And there they were in Holland for 11 years. But then they decided, after much prayer, that they wanted to come to the New World. And so they were sent out, and they came to Plymouth in the south of England. And there they boarded the Mayflower in September of 1620. After 2 months, they finally arrived in Cape Cod. It was a terrible journey. Horrendous storms at sea. And it was really only God that kept them and preserved them. There were many divine providences. And in the midst of all those, the pilgrims would praise God, pray to God, witness to the sailors who were on board the ship. And finally, when they arrived in Cape Cod and they saw the land, they fell on their knees, they sang Psalm 100, and William Bradford, one of the early governors, said this: "Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to the land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. Being thus past the vast ocean and a sea of troubles before, in their preparation, as may be remembered by that which went before, they now had no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain them, nor refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair or to seek for succor." And so here, Bradford remembers God's providence. He also remembers that when they were initially sent out, they had full provisions. And yet now, as they arrived, there was none of that. There was not a receiving community. There wasn't full provisions. And so that first winter was a terrible winter, horrible winter. They landed in Cape Cod, November the 11th. They ended up moving north and landed in what is called Plymouth, Massachusetts. On December the 11th is when they made land. They immediately got to work. And yet that first winter, and it was late now, this is December in New England. There was much sleet, much snow, freezing temperatures. And during that winter, over half of the 102 died. They died of sickness. Indeed, of the 17 husbands, 10 died. And then of the 17 pilgrims' wives, 14 died. Yet God kept them. In the spring of the year, when things began to thaw and they knew they needed to get their plants growing, and yet the way to go about it in New England was different than what they knew back in England. And yet the Lord sent to them Samoset. He was the head of the Algonquin tribe north of Maine, in Maine. And he came and he just walked right into the camp. They were frightened, and yet he proved to be someone really sent by God. A few weeks later, he came back and he brought 5 other Indians with him, one whose name was Squanto. And Squanto had originally been from that very region where the Pilgrims now landed. It was called the Patuxent Indian tribe. But about 5 years earlier, he had been captured by a treacherous English captain and taken back to England and sold into slavery. And yet soon after he had been taken back, 5 years earlier, his tribe, and it was a warring tribe, they were hit with the plague and they all died out. And in the providence of God, the Pilgrims landed there. There's quite a story behind it. And now Samoset, because Squanto has now returned to the area, comes into their tent. He knows English well. And he has a liking to the Pilgrims. He in turn introduces them to a tribe south of there, the Wampanoag Indians, and to their king, King Massasoit. And so they make peace with Indians from the north and Indians from the south, and Squanto becomes one of them, and he teaches them how to go about fishing and even taking the eels and using their carcasses to kind of plant Indian corn in it so it would thrive and grow. And if it weren't for Squanto and with the peace treaties with these other Indians, they could have all been lost. And it was then in that fall of 1621 that they had finally regained their health, had regained their strength. Over half of their numbers had been lost, but they were praising God. And it says in the writings of Mort's relation, Edward Winslow, says this: "After our harvest had been begotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, and so that we might after a special manner rejoice." So that after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labor, they 4 in one day killed much fowl, as with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time amongst other recreations we exercised our arms or shot their guns. Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest the greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, whom for 3 days, 5 deer, which they brought into the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty. Writing back to friends in England. For 3 days they celebrated with King Massasoit and the Wampanoag Indians and Squanto, and that became then an annual tradition. There's still harsh winters ahead, and it was only by the spring of 1623 that they were really established. Throughout, whether on the ocean, the desolate wilderness, the severe temperatures, the death, the Pilgrims were always praising God. These were men and William and children who thank God in the midst of adversity and thank God for his kind providences and the abundance he provided. And so too, let us this day remember them. 75% of the signers of the Constitution descended from the Puritans and from Pilgrims. That's what made this nation so great. And so in your Thanksgiving, give thanks to God for adversity and for bounty he has provided for us.